The boy only said one sentence.
Excuse me, ma'am. I think I can read that 500-year-old contract.
White marble floor, 40-foot ceiling. A 12-year-old black boy, torn shoes exposing his toes, standing before the contract that Harvard, Oxford, and the Sorbonne couldn't crack in 3 years. Dr. Vivian Hargrove, museum director, granddaughter of the founder, turned, eyes dragging from his torn shoes up past his black skin.
14 experts, $200 million, and some street kid reeking of the gutter says he can read it?
She stepped closer.
Someone like you doesn't deserve to breathe the air in this building.
The boy opened his mouth. Hargrove's hand swung, slapped him across the face. Blood hit white marble. His knee cracked against the floor. He pushed himself back up, shaking, and stared straight at her. Hargrove wiped her hand on her blazer.
Get him out! Temple of scholarship, not a shelter for street rats.
Phones up, live streams. Not one person spoke up. But no one knew. The boy they just threw out was the only person on earth who could read that contract. And when the truth came out, the one who slapped would be the one bowing. Blood on white marble. A 12-year-old's blood. That image doesn't leave you. I'm Vance Narrator. I dig up the stories that institutions try to bury. This one was buried under 70 years of money, reputation, and silence. Until a kid with torn shoes opened his mouth. The door of the Hargrove Museum closed behind him with the sound of something final. Not a slam. Worse. A slow, heavy click. The kind that says, "You were never meant to be here." Amos Crawford stood on the front steps, the Charleston sun pressing down on his thin shoulders. Blood was still drying on his chin. His hand was still shaking. But he didn't cry. He hadn't cried since he was 7. The day of school told him his brain was too big for a boy his color and his zip code. That year, a teacher had spotted his gift. A kid who could pick up languages like other kids picked up colds. She got him into a gifted program. On the first day, a parent complained about that boy from the barber shop being in the class. The school quietly removed him. No explanation, no appeal. Just a note in his file and a seat that was empty on Monday. He learned that day that being brilliant wasn't enough if you were brilliant in the wrong skin. He pressed the leather journal against his ribs and started walking. 12 blocks east, past the boutique coffee shops and the real estate signs eating his neighborhood alive, Amos pushed open the glass door of Desmond's barber shop. The bell jingled. 3 men in chairs looked up. Desmond Taylor, 52, Navy veteran, built like a man who had carried things heavier than furniture, saw the boy's face and put down his clippers. Who? One word. That was all Desmond needed. Amos shook his head. Nobody. Desmond looked at the blood on the boy's chin. He wet a clean towel with warm water, knelt down on one knee. This big man, this veteran, kneeling on a barbershop floor, and wiped the blood off a child's face without a word. Then he went back to cutting hair, because Desmond had learned a long time ago that a boy will talk when a boy is ready. Upstairs in the apartment that smelled like lavender soap and old books, Della Crawford sat in her chair by the window. She was 81. Some days she knew exactly where she was. Some days she thought Amos was his father. Today was somewhere in between. "Baby," she said, not turning from the window. "Did you go to the House of Glass?" Amos stopped in the doorway. "Yes, Grandma." "Did they listen?" He looked at her, this tiny woman in a cotton dress, the woman who had spent 14 years sitting at a kitchen table teaching him a language that no university on earth had in its database. She called it Fala Cree. She'd learned it from her mother, Who learned it from hers? Who learned it from hers? All the way back to a people who once traded as equals with Portuguese kings and signed contracts in their own tongue. 10 generations, kitchen to kitchen, mother to child. A chain of voices stretching back 500 years, held together by nothing but love and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to let a language die. Not yet, Grandma. She nodded slowly, her fingers resting on the leather journal's twin. Her own copy, older, the pages yellowed and soft as cloth. They will. The words don't die because the ears aren't ready. That night, Amos sat on the floor beside her chair and read to her from the journal. Fala Cree filled the small apartment. Rolling, tonal, beautiful. A language the world believed had been dead for 300 years, alive in a kitchen above a barber shop, carried in the mouth of a 12-year-old boy who had nowhere else to carry it. This was his life. School, when he could make it. The library, when he couldn't. Cooking for Della, rice and beans, the only thing he knew how to make that she'd always eat. Bathing her on bad days. Reminding her what year it was, what city they lived in, what her name was. Reading to her every night in the old tongue so the language would not die when her memory finally did. He wasn't trying to be a genius. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was trying to keep a promise he'd made when he was 8 years old, and she had sat him down and said, "When I forget, you remember. That's your job. You remember for both of us." Meanwhile, 22 blocks west, inside the museum that had just thrown him out, something was happening that Dr. Vivian Hargrove did not expect. Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, 45, linguistics professor from Columbia University, hired 8 months ago as a consulting translator, had been standing in the atrium when the boy spoke. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't filmed. She had frozen. Because what the boy said, casually, quietly, in a sentence meant for no one, contained phonetic structures she recognized. Old Portuguese pidgin roots, West African tonal layering, a grammatical skeleton that matched fragments she had seen in exactly 3 colonial archives across 2 continents. She went to her office, closed the door, pulled up the museum's high-resolution scan of the contract. She stared at the seal in the bottom corner, the seal that had confused every expert for 3 years. Then she rotated the image 180 degrees. The seal clicked into place. The orientation markers aligned. The first clause, previously gibberish, suddenly followed a known Luso-African trade formula. The kid was right. The contract had been scanned upside down. For 3 years, by 14 experts, $200 million in funding, and a 12-year-old boy in torn shoes had spotted it in 15 seconds. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She picked up her bag, walked past the security desk, pushed through the front doors, and stepped out into the Charleston heat. She had to find him. It took her 2 days. She asked at corner stores, churches, a laundromat. Nobody in East Chapel gave up information to a white woman in a blazer asking about a black child. She understood why. She kept asking politely. On the second day, Desmond Taylor blocked the barbershop door with his body. "Whatever you're selling, he ain't buying." "I'm not selling anything. I'm a linguist. I was there when they threw him out. He was right. About the seal, about the language, about all of it." Desmond studied her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside, not all the way, just enough for her to turn sideways and squeeze past. Amos sat in the back chair, the journal on his lap. He looked up and his face went hard. "You work for the woman who hit me." "I did. I'm not sure I do anymore." Silence. The barbershop hummed, clippers, radio, the low murmur of men who were pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Then Amos opened the journal to a random page and read a sentence aloud in Fala Cree. The sounds filled the room. Consonants that clicked, vowels that rose and fell like birdsong, rhythms that belonged to no modern language Eleanor had ever studied. She gripped the back of a barber chair. 20 years studying dead languages. She had never heard one come back to life. Where did you learn this? My grandmother. She learned from hers, and hers from hers, all the way back. This language, it's not in any database, any archive, anywhere. Amos closed the journal, held it against his chest. That's because it was never in a building. It was in our kitchen. Eleanor asked to record him. Amos shook his head. Not until they apologize. Eleanor walked out of that barbershop knowing two things. The boy was real, and the museum had made the worst mistake in its 70-year history. What she didn't know yet, what nobody knew, was that the contract didn't just contain a trade agreement. Its final clause held something that would crack the ground beneath the museum itself. The crack started small. Eleanor went back to the museum and said nothing to Hargrove. Instead, she shared her findings, the rotated seal, the corrected orientation, the Luso-African trade formula, with 2 junior researchers. Within 48 hours, both confirmed independently that the first clause of the contract, previously unreadable, now made structural sense. 3 years of failure. 1 rotated image, and the only reason anyone thought to rotate it was because a 12-year-old boy had said 6 words before getting slapped across the face. The junior researchers wrote a memo. The memo reached the board. The board reached Hargrove. She read it in her office, standing, one hand on her mahogany desk. Her jaw tightened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. Invite the boy back. Frame it as community engagement, nothing more. 1 week later, Amos walked back into the Hargrove Museum, this time through the front door. This time accompanied by Desmond Taylor in a pressed shirt with his arms folded like a man guarding something precious, and Eleanor walking beside them with a laptop bag over her shoulder and a look on her face that dared anyone to say a word. The conference room was everything the apartment was not. Long oak table, leather chairs, recessed lighting, a recording device, and a pitcher of water that probably cost more than Amos's shoes. Dr. Vivian Hargrove sat at the head with 2 curators and a public relations officer arranged behind her like a wall. We appreciate young people who take an interest in history, Hargrove began. Warm smile, open hands. The voice of a woman who had practiced this sentence in a mirror. Amos looked at her, at the hand that had hit him, at the mouth that had called him a street rat, at the blazer she was wearing, different from that day but the same woman underneath. He didn't sit down. He stood at the end of the table, the leather journal in one hand, and spoke in a voice so steady it didn't sound like it could belong to a 12-year-old. Before I read 1 word of that contract, here's what's going to happen. The PR officer opened his mouth. Desmond shifted his weight forward, just slightly, just enough. The officer closed it. 1. You will make a public statement that I was thrown out of this museum and hit across the face, not because of what I said, but because of what I look like. Silence. 2. If my translation is used in any exhibit, any publication, any press release, the credit goes to Della Crawford, my grandmother. She is the source, not this museum, not you. Her name goes on the wall next to that contract. Hargrove's pen stopped moving. 3. You will fund a language preservation program in East Chapel, not run by your people, run by ours. 4. You, Dr. Hargrove, will come to my grandmother's home. You will sit at her kitchen table. You will listen to her speak the language your museum couldn't read. You will look her in the eye and tell her that her knowledge matters. 5. Whatever that contract says, all of it gets made public. No cuts, no summaries, no rewrites. The full text, translated, available to everyone. The recording device captured nothing but breathing. The water in the pitcher didn't move. Nobody touched it. Hargrove set down her pen, slowly, deliberately, like someone putting down a weapon. You're a 12-year-old boy, asking a $200 million institution to bend to your terms. Amos didn't blink. No, ma'am. I'm the only person alive who can read your centerpiece exhibit. I'm not asking. I'm telling you the price of my voice. Behind him, Desmond put a hand on the boy's shoulder, not to hold him back, not to guide him, to steady himself. In 52 years, through boot camp and a war zone and a divorce and a business built from nothing, Desmond Taylor had never been prouder of any human being he had ever known. Hargrove stared at the boy for a long time. Something moved behind her eyes. Not remorse, not yet, but the first flicker of a woman realizing she had miscalculated badly. "We will consider your terms," she said. Amos turned and walked out. Desmond followed. The door closed behind them softly, a different sound than the one that had closed on Amos the first time. This time, it was the museum that was left inside. Eleanor stayed behind. She waited until the PR officer and the curators filed out. Then she leaned across the table, close enough that Hargrove could see the lines under her eyes from the days she'd spent in East Chapel, and said very quietly, "If you don't agree to every single one of those conditions, I will publish my own findings, with his name, with his grandmother's name." "And with the fact that your chief curator assaulted a 12-year-old child in front of 30 witnesses who filmed it?" Hargrove's face went the color of the marble in her lobby. "You have 1 week," Eleanor said, and left. The museum had 7 days to decide. But the clock was already ticking on something bigger, because Eleanor had begun working on the contract's middle clauses, and what she found in Clause 5 would change everything. The contract had a rule buried inside it. It could only be activated by a living voice, one specific voice, and that voice belonged to the boy they slapped. The kitchen table was small, scratched, one leg shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard. It had held 40 years of meals, homework, arguments, prayers, and one grandmother's patient, relentless effort to pour a dying language into a little boy's ears before her mind took it away. And now, it held the most important linguistic discovery of the 21st century. Eleanor came to the apartment above the barbershop on a Tuesday morning with recording equipment, a laptop, 2 notebooks, and a box of pastries from the bakery on 5th Street. Amos let her in, not warmly, not coldly, the way you let in a doctor you don't fully trust but might need. They sat across from each other at Della's table. The leather journal lay between them like a bridge neither had fully crossed. Amos opened it to the first page, placed his finger under the first line, and began to read the contract aloud, clause by clause, in Fala Cree. The language filled the small kitchen the way a song fills a church, not just sound, but presence, tonal, rhythmic, consonants that clicked against the teeth, vowels that rose and fell like someone breathing underwater. Every word had weight. Every pause had architecture. Eleanor typed furiously, mapping phonemes to known Portuguese root structures, cross-referencing with Dutch colonial trade records she had pulled from 3 different university databases, tracking the tonal shifts that marked Fala Cree as something that belonged to no European language family, something entirely its own. something that had survived not in libraries or databases, but in the warm, ordinary, sacred space between a grandmother and a child. They worked for 3 hours the first day, 4 the second, 5 the third. By the fourth day, something had shifted. Eleanor stopped treating Amos like a research subject and started treating him like what he was, a colleague. The only colleague in the world who could do what he did. This word here, second clause, third line. What's the root? Amos tilted his head, thought. It means exchange, but not like buying and selling, more like giving something and trusting you'll get something back. My grandma says it's the word you use between people who respect each other. You can't use it if one person has power over the other. It only works between equals. Eleanor wrote it down. She had to put the pen down afterward because her hand wouldn't stop shaking. She had spent 20 years in classrooms and conference halls and tenure meetings, and the most precise, most nuanced linguistic knowledge she had ever encountered was sitting across from her in a boy's pajama pants, eating a pastry with one hand and conjugating an extinct verb form with the other. On the 5th day, Della had a lucid moment. She had been in her chair by the window all morning, quiet, distant, somewhere else. Eleanor was struggling with a word in clause 3 that didn't follow any pattern she recognized. She asked Amos. He frowned. Grandma taught me that one, but I don't remember exactly. From across the room, without turning from the window, Della spoke. Her voice was thin but steady, like a thread that could still hold weight. That word means to hold without crushing. It's what you do with a baby bird, or a promise. The room stopped. Eleanor looked at Amos. Amos looked at his grandmother. Della turned from the window and smiled. Not a confused smile, not a foggy smile, but the full, warm, knowing smile of a woman who was still in there, still holding the words, still keeping the fire. Eleanor wrote it down. When she looked at what she'd written, the letters were shaking on the page. Nah, I gotta be honest with you. This part wrecked me. My grandma spoke Creole, Louisiana Creole. That thing that sounds like French got lost in West Africa and never came home. She'd talked to me in it when I was little. Did I learn it? Nah, I was a kid. I thought she'd be around forever. She died on a Tuesday. And that language, her language, technically my language, it just left the room with her. I'm 41. I remember 3 words. 3! And here's this kid, 12 years old, doing what I was too stupid to do. That hits different. That evening, Desmond came upstairs with food. Rice and beans, cornbread, golden, thick, the kind that takes patience. Lemonade in a plastic pitcher with a crack down the side that had been there for years. He set the plates on the kitchen table between the laptop and the journal, pulled up a chair, and pointed at Eleanor with a serving spoon. You eat. You work too hard and eat too little. That's a problem I can fix. Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. Amos laughed too. A 12-year-old laugh, full and loose and silly. The sound of a kid who had been carrying the weight of a legacy and a sick grandmother and an extinct language on his back. And for one moment, just one, set it down to be a kid eating cornbread at a kitchen table with people who felt like family. Desmond told Eleanor about Amos, how the boy used to stand on a milk crate in the barber shop and read aloud to customers. Sometimes English, sometimes French he'd taught himself from library books. Sometimes Falacree that nobody understood but everybody felt. Half the time, nobody knew what he was saying, Desmond said, scraping butter across a piece of cornbread. But they listened, every single time, because when that boy speaks, you feel it in your chest. Eleanor watched Desmond teach Amos how to season cornbread properly. You can't rush the butter, little man. Butter's got its own schedule. And she understood something that hadn't been in any of her research. This wasn't a project. This was a family, held together by cornbread and a dead language and the kind of love that doesn't need a reason or a contract or a blood test. Over the next 3 days, the contract's contents emerged piece by piece. Clauses 1 through 3 were standard trade terms: goods, quantities, seasonal exchange schedules between the Cree Merchant Federation and Portuguese trading outposts along the West African coast. Mundane on the surface, but historically explosive. Proof that the Cree were not passive subjects of colonialism, but active, equal commercial partners negotiating on their own terms in their own language. Clause 4 was a mutual non-aggression pact. The Cree and the Portuguese agreed to protect each other's merchants in transit. Equal footing, equal risk, equal language. Clause 5 stopped Eleanor cold. She read her translation 3 times, then a 4th. Then she stood up and walked to the window and stared at the street below for 2 full minutes before speaking. The contract contained a validation clause, a voice clause. The treaty was only legally binding if read aloud in Fala Cree by a recognized member of the Cree lineage. No written signature could replace the living voice. No translation could substitute for the original tongue. It was an oral legal tradition with no European equivalent, a system that said, the law lives in the voice of the people, not on the paper of the powerful. Amos Crawford was the last living speaker of Fala Cree, the only person on Earth who could activate the contract. Clause 6 remained partially untranslated. The ink was damaged in places, and some of the formal legal vocabulary was beyond what Della had taught him. But the fragments Eleanor pieced together pointed toward something enormous. Land, coastal territory, perpetual rights. The word herons appeared twice, the word river 3 times, and a phrase Amos translated as, for as long as the water remembers the shore. Eleanor called Nina Holloway that night. Nina, 34, civil rights attorney, Charleston Legal Aid Society, sharp as a scalpel and funded like a lemonade stand. Nina, I need you to listen very carefully. This is not just a museum artifact. Then what is it? It might be a live, legal document with an active land claim on the ground the museum is sitting on. Silence on the other end. Then, I'm coming over. Eleanor's second call was to Professor Gerald Townsend at Howard University, 68, retired, the only black linguist in America who had ever published academic work on Luso-African Creoles. He listened for 4 minutes without saying a word. Then, I'll be on the first flight tomorrow morning. The team was forming. A linguist, a lawyer, a professor, a barber, a grandmother losing her memory. And at the center of it all, a 12-year-old boy holding a leather journal that contained the key to everything. But the museum was watching, and what Hargrove did next would prove that power doesn't negotiate when it feels threatened. It attacks. Hargrove struck first, hard, fast, with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how institutions destroy people who threaten them. 3 days after the confrontation in the conference room, the Hargrove Museum issued a press release. The language was elegant, measured, and devastating. The Hargrove Museum is pleased to announce that the 1526 Atlantic contract has been satisfactorily translated through the dedicated efforts of our in-house research team. Personal claims of translation assistance are unverified and do not reflect the museum's official scholarly process. Eleanor read it on her phone standing in the barber shop. Her coffee went cold in her hand. "They're stealing it," she said quietly. "They're not stealing it," Desmond replied from behind the barber chair, clippers still running. "They already stole it. Now they're just writing the receipt." But Hargrove wasn't finished. That same afternoon, a caseworker from Charleston County Child Protective Services knocked on the barbershop door. Desmond opened it. A woman in a gray suit, clipboard in hand, lanyard around her neck. We've received a report regarding the welfare of a minor, Amos Crawford, currently residing with an elderly woman with a diagnosed cognitive impairment. We need to conduct a home assessment. Desmond's hand tightened on the doorframe until his knuckles went pale. Who filed the report? That information is confidential, sir. But everyone knew. Upstairs, Amos was sitting on the floor beside Della's chair. She was having a bad day, one of the worst. She had called him by his father's name 3 times. She didn't recognize the apartment. She kept asking to go home, not understanding that she was home, that this had been home for 36 years. And now, someone wanted to take him away from her. Desmond came upstairs. He didn't sugarcoat it. He knelt in front of Amos the same way he had knelt to wipe blood off the boy's chin. One knee down, eyes level, voice steady. Listen to me. Nobody is taking you anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not while I'm breathing. You hear me? Amos looked at him. His voice was flat. She filed it. Hargrove. She's trying to separate me from Grandma so I can't translate the contract. I know. If they take me, the language dies. Grandma can't teach anyone else. She barely remembers me. I know that too. And that's exactly why we're not going to let it happen. The media arrived next. A reporter at the Charleston Post caught wind of the CPS filing, connected it to the museum press release, and ran a story under the headline, "Museum says translation solved. Street kid says they're lying." The story went viral in 12 hours. Social media cracked in half. The museum supporters lined up behind 70 years of institutional prestige, the Peabody nomination, the endowment, the academic partnerships with universities whose names people whispered like prayers. Amos's supporters shared the live stream video from the museum atrium, the one that showed a grown woman slapping a 12-year-old boy across the face. But the ugly voices were louder. They always are, at first. Comment sections filled like open sewers. Why would we believe a dropout over a PhD? Another welfare kid looking for a check. Where are this boy's parents? Oh, right, nowhere. The museum should sue. Somebody call ICE. Oh, wait, wrong minority. LOL. Amos read them, all of them. He sat on the couch with the laptop balanced on his knees and scrolled through every comment, his face completely still, the way the face of a child goes still when it learns for the 2nd or 3rd time that the world is exactly as cruel as it suspected. He closed the laptop, carefully, the way you close something you don't want to break because you might need it later. Desmond sat down beside him, didn't speak right away. Let the silence do what silence does. Then, don't read that stuff, Amos. They think I'm nothing. Desmond was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough like gravel under tires. Your grandmother didn't raise nothing. She raised the last voice of a language that entire empires, Portuguese, Dutch, British, American, tried to wipe off the face of the earth. 4 empires, 500 years, and they failed because of one old woman in a cotton dress sitting in a kitchen teaching a little boy words that kings were afraid of. You tell me who's nothing. Amos didn't answer, but his hands unclenched. That night, Della had a lucid moment, the clearest in weeks. She sat up in her chair, looked directly at Amos and said his name, his real name, not his father's. Then she began to sing a Fala Cree lullaby. low and slow and ancient, with a melody that moved like water over river stones. She had sung it to him every night when he was small, before the dementia, before the forgetting, when the world was just the two of them and a kitchen table and a language only they could speak. Amos took out his phone, pressed record. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Eleanor was in the hallway. She had come to drop off research notes. She heard the singing through the cracked door. She pressed her back against the wall, slid down until she was sitting on the floor, covered her mouth with both hands, and cried without making a sound. Not because it was sad, because it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. A grandmother singing her grandson to sleep in a language that the entire world had given up for dead. And it was alive, right here, in this hallway, in this building, above this barber shop, in this neighborhood that the city was trying to gentrify into oblivion. The song lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, Della closed her eyes and drifted away again. Amos sat beside her, phone in his lap, recording saved. That recording would change everything. Nina Holloway filed an emergency motion the following Monday morning. 3 claims, each one a knife. 1. The museum's press release constituted public fraud, claiming institutional credit for a translation produced entirely by an independent minor and an outside consultant. 2. The CPS complaint was filed in bad faith as institutional retaliation against a 12-year-old child who had embarrassed the museum's leadership. 3. The contract contained a live, unextinguished legal claim, a perpetual land grant, that the museum was actively attempting to suppress. The judge reviewed the motion, asked 2 questions, and granted an evidentiary hearing. 2 weeks out. Hargrove's corporate legal team, 3 attorneys from a firm that charged $900 an hour and had never lost a case involving a nonprofit institution, filed a counter-motion the same day. Their arguments were clean, cold, and precisely engineered. The contract was museum property, legally acquired in 1988. The boy had no standing, no credentials, no formal education. An oral tradition did not meet evidentiary standards. The hearing was frivolous. Nina read their filing alone in her office, a room the size of a walk-in closet with 1 desk, 1 laptop, 1 printer that jammed every 3rd page, and a law degree from a school that nobody on Hargrove's legal team had ever heard of. She called Amos that evening. They're going to try to make you look small in that courtroom. They've got 3 lawyers in $1,000 suits, 2 expert witnesses with more degrees than teeth, and 70 years of institutional reputation. You know what we've got? What? Your voice. That's it. Your voice, your grandmother's journal, and the truth. So when you stand up in that room, you don't argue, you don't explain, you don't defend yourself. You speak. In Fala Cree, in the language they said was dead. That's your only job. Just speak. 2 weeks, 1 hearing. A 12-year-old boy against a $200 million institution with 3 lawyers who had never lost. But none of them, not the lawyers, not the curators, not the woman who had slapped him, had ever faced an opponent who carried a dead language in his mouth and a 500-year-old land deed in his blood. Charleston County Courthouse, 8:45 in the morning. Rain coming down in sheets. The kind of rain that turns Charleston streets into rivers and makes everything smell like salt and history. The gallery was full before 9. Reporters packed the back row. Cameras they weren't allowed to turn on. Notebooks they couldn't write in fast enough. Community members from East Chapel filled the middle rows, some in church clothes, some in work uniforms, all of them there because word had traveled through the barbershop the way it always did. Desmond told one person, and by morning the whole neighborhood knew. Desmond himself stood near the courtroom door in his navy dress uniform, pressed, pinned, every medal in place. He hadn't worn it in 11 years. He ironed it at 4 in the morning. He wore it today because some battles require you to show up in full armor, even when you're not the one fighting. And in the front row, in a wheelchair, wearing a pale blue hat and a cotton dress with tiny yellow flowers, sat Della Crawford. The leather journal rested in her lap. Her hands lay on top of it gently, the way you hold something alive. She was having a good day. She knew where she was. She knew why she was here. She had asked Amos to button her top button, and when he did, she said, "I want to look proper when they hear our words." Hargrove's legal team presented first. 3 lawyers, 2 expert witnesses, a binder thick enough to use as a doorstop. Their argument was clean, clinical, and built like a machine. The contract was museum property, acquired through legal purchase in 1988 from a private European collection. The boy had no academic credentials, no formal training, no institutional affiliation. The so-called oral tradition was unverifiable, and the concept of a voice clause, a legal requirement that a contract be activated by a living speaker of a specific language, had no precedent in any American court, state or federal, in the history of the Republic. The lead attorney paused for effect, adjusted his glasses, and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we are being asked to accept the testimony of a 12-year-old child with no formal education as superior to the work of 14 internationally recognized linguistic scholars. This is not a serious legal proceeding. It is a publicity stunt dressed in cultural sentiment." Nina Holloway stood, 5'3", 1 binder, 1 laptop, 1 suit she'd bought on sale 3 years ago, and the calm, steady expression of a woman who had spent her entire career being underestimated and had learned to use it. The defense calls Professor Gerald Townsend. Townsend took the stand the way a man sits down at a piano he's been waiting his whole life to play. 68 years old, 40 years in linguistics, published in journals that Hargrove's experts had cited in their own dissertations. The only black scholar in America who had devoted his career to the study of Luso-African Creoles, languages born from the meeting of Portuguese traders and West African civilizations in the 15th and 16th centuries. Nina asked him to explain Fala Cree. Townsend spoke carefully, like a man laying bricks. Fala Cree was a trade Creole, he explained, a contact language that emerged between Portuguese merchants and the Cree Merchant Federation along the West African coast in the early 1500s. Fragments had been found in 3 colonial archives, Portuguese, Dutch, and British. No complete grammar existed. No audio recording had ever been made. No living speaker had ever been documented. The language was officially classified as extinct in 1726. "Until now," Nina said. "Until now," Townsend confirmed. Nina turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to play a recording." She pressed play. The courtroom speakers filled with the voice of Amos Crawford reading the contract in Fala Cree. The sound moved through the room like something rising from deep water, old and alive and undeniable. Tonal shifts that no modern language used, rhythms that didn't belong to any European family. A 12-year-old boy speaking a language that the world's best scholars had declared dead 3 centuries ago. Speaking it fluently, naturally, the way you speak the language you dreamed in as a child. The recording lasted 40 seconds. When it stopped, the courtroom was completely silent. Townsend removed his glasses, set them on the rail. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the judge. He looked straight ahead at something none of them could see. "I have spent 40 years searching for this language. 40 years. 3 continents, a dozen archives. I've read every fragment, every colonial footnote, every trader's journal that mentioned the Cree by name. And it was alive, the whole time, in a boy's kitchen in Charleston, taught to him by his grandmother who learned it from hers, who learned it from hers. His voice broke. He let it break. There is no database, no algorithm, no artificial intelligence, no institution on this earth that could produce what you just heard. That is a living human being speaking a language that the world abandoned. If this court silences that voice, it will be the court that finally kills what 500 years of empires could not. A reporter in the back row lowered her phone. She wasn't recording anymore. She had forgotten to. Nina called her next witness. "The court calls Amos Crawford." The boy stood up from the gallery. He walked to the witness box. He was wearing a white button-down shirt Desmond had pressed for him that morning and his cleanest pair of jeans. He looked small behind the microphone. His feet didn't quite reach the floor. Nina placed a photocopy of the contract's final page on the rail in front of him. "Amos, Clause 6, the final clause, has never been fully translated by any expert. Can you read it for the court?" Hargrove's lead attorney stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness has no qualifications to overruled." The judge didn't look up from his papers. "The boy may read." Amos picked up the page. He looked out at the gallery, past the reporters, past the lawyers, past the strangers. He found Della in the front row, her pale blue hat, her hands on the journal, her eyes, clear today, present today, looking at him the way she had looked at him every night at the kitchen table for 14 years. She nodded. He read Clause 6 in Fala Cree. The courtroom disappeared. The lawyers disappeared. The marble and the microphones and the fluorescent lights disappeared. There was only the language, rolling out of him like a river finding its way back to the sea. 500 years of words, 10 generations of voices, all of them alive in the mouth of a 12-year-old boy who had learned them at a scratched kitchen table from a woman the world had already started to forget. Then he translated. "This land, from the mouth of the river to the place where the herons stand, is held by the Cree family and their children's children for as long as the water remembers the shore. No empire can take what the water remembers. Let this be read aloud by a child of the Cree in the tongue of the Cree, and let it be so. The land, the Charleston waterfront, the museum's ground, 500 years. His family's name." Amos set the paper down. He looked at the judge. "My grandmother is sitting in this courtroom. She can't always remember my name. Some days she thinks I'm my father. But every single day of my life, she remembered this language. Every word, every rule, every sound. She sat with me at our kitchen table and gave me something no school ever gave me, no museum ever offered me, no one in a suit ever thought I deserved. She gave me a voice that is 500 years old. I'm not here because I want something from you. I'm here because that contract, the one your museum put behind glass and called a mystery, has my family's name in it. Our land, our voice. You don't get to keep it locked up and call it yours. You don't get to throw me out of a building that sits on my grandmother's ground. I am Amos Crawford. I am a child of the Cree, and I just read your exhibit." Silence. The kind that doesn't end. It just changes what the room means. Then from the front row, a thin voice. Della Crawford in her wheelchair, her pale blue hat, her cotton dress with yellow flowers, spoke one sentence in Fala Cree. 4 words, clear as a bell ringing in an empty church. Every head turned. Professor Townsend, still at the witness table, translated. His voice broke on the last word. She said, "The water remembers." In the 3rd row, Dr. Vivian Hargrove lowered her head. Not a performance, not a strategy. Her head went down because it could not stay up. Look, I know this is a story. I wrote it. But here's what got under my skin after I finished. UNESCO says a language disappears every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, man. Almost half of 7,000 languages are barely hanging on. And who's keeping them alive? Not professors. Grandmothers. In kitchens. Amos ain't real. But the Amoses are out there right now. And if your grandma spoke something you never learned, yeah, you feel this one. You feel this one. The judge hadn't ruled yet, but the courtroom already had. The ruling came 3 days later. 1, the CPS complaint was dismissed as retaliatory. The judge used the word weaponized in his written opinion and referred the filing to the State Bar for review. 2, the museum's press release was struck as materially misleading. A public correction was ordered within 72 hours. 3, Amos Crawford's oral testimony was admitted as living cultural evidence under the South Carolina Heritage Preservation Act. The voice clause was recognized as a valid contractual mechanism. The first time in American legal history that a spoken language had been ruled a form of legal authentication. 4, the land claim would proceed to a full hearing with the 1526 contract admitted as primary evidence and the Crawford family recognized as the petitioning party. Nina Holloway read the ruling alone in her office, the closet with the bad printer and the law degree from a school nobody had heard of. She set the paper down, put her head in her hands, stayed there for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. "We won the hearing, Amos. The contract is in. The land claim goes forward. And your grandmother's name is in the ruling. 4 times. On the other end, silence. Then the sound of a 12-year-old boy exhaling, the kind of breath that leaves the body when something you've been holding for your entire short life finally loosens its grip. Is it over? Not yet. But the hard part is. The aftermath arrived slowly, the way real things do when they aren't made for television. The museum's board of directors convened an emergency session. The math was brutal and simple. A viable land claim backed by a federal-level legal precedent, a PR catastrophe that had gone international, and a chief curator who had been caught on 30 cell phone videos slapping a 12-year-old child across the face. 70 years of reputation cracking like old marble. Dr. Vivian Hargrove resigned. Not fired. She resigned, with a public statement that navigated around the word apology with the precision of a surgeon avoiding a nerve. She acknowledged a failure of institutional process and personal judgment. She did not mention the slap. She did not say Amos's name. The statement satisfied no one, but it opened a door, barely visible, barely wide enough to walk through. 2 weeks later, Eleanor stopped by the museum to collect her personal files. The building felt different. Quieter, uncertain, like a house after a funeral. She found Hargrove alone in the exhibit hall, standing in front of the glass case that held the contract. The lights were low. The room was empty. Hargrove spoke without turning. "I spent 30 years making this museum matter, building something. And a boy with a notebook undid it in an afternoon." Eleanor set her bag on the floor. "He didn't undo it, Vivian. He completed it. The contract was always here, you just couldn't read it." None of us could. Silence. The contract sat behind its glass, ancient and patient. His grandmother, Hargrove said. Does she know what happened? She has good days and bad days. On the good days, she knows. Hargrove nodded. She left the hall without another word. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning that smelled like rain, there was a knock on the apartment door above the barber shop. Amos opened it and stopped. Dr. Vivian Hargrove stood in the hallway. No blazer, no museum lanyard, no title. A plain blouse, flat shoes, and a small bouquet of yellow flowers held in front of her body the way people hold things when they aren't sure they deserve to offer them. May I see your grandmother? Amos looked at her for a long time, at the hand that had slapped him, at the flowers, at the face, older now, drawn, stripped of the armor she had worn for 30 years. He stepped aside. Hargrove sat at the kitchen table. The table, the same one where the language had survived, where Eleanor and Amos had cracked the contract clause by clause, where Desmond had served cornbread and taught a Columbia professor how to season food, where a dying woman had spent 14 years giving a boy the only inheritance she had. Della was in her chair by the window. Bad day. Her eyes drifted. She didn't recognize the visitor. She was somewhere else, somewhere between now and then, between memory and forgetting. Hargrove spoke anyway. Her voice was small, smaller than Amos had ever heard it. Mrs. Crawford, my name is Vivian. I came to tell you that your language, the one you kept alive, the one you gave your grandson, it changed everything. I didn't listen when I should have. I stood in a room full of people and I treated your grandson like he was nothing. He wasn't nothing. He was everything. And I am sorry. I'm listening now. Della looked at her, a long, floating look, the kind that comes from a mind wrapped in fog, reaching for something solid. For a moment, nothing. Then, a flicker. Recognition. Not of the name, not of the face, something deeper. The recognition of one woman looking at another woman who was asking to be forgiven. Della reached out and patted Hargrove's hand, gently, the way you touch a baby bird or a promise. Then she spoke, 4 words in Fala Cree. Amos translated from the doorway. His voice was barely above a whisper. She said, "You came late, but you came." Hargrove put her face in her hands and wept. At a kitchen table, in a neighborhood she had never visited, in front of a woman whose existence she had tried to erase. The museum reopened the exhibit 1 month later. New title on the wall, etched in letters 3 inches tall. The Cree Contract, translated by Della Crawford and Amos Crawford, keepers of Fala Cree. Della attended the opening. Wheelchair, pale blue hat, lucid, radiant. She looked up at the wall and saw her name, inside the building that had thrown her grandson out. She reached up and touched the glass case with her fingertips. She didn't say anything. She just smiled. Beside the contract, in its own case, lay the leather journal. 10 generations of handwritten grammar. The museum had it on loan. The ownership was Amos's. The land claim settled 8 weeks later. Not in a courtroom, in a quiet conference room with lawyers on both sides and coffee no one drank. The museum would remain on its land, but under a perpetual lease paid to the Crawford Family Trust. The trust's first project? A new building, 3 blocks east of the barbershop. The Della Crawford Center for Living Languages. Amos was named its founding voice and the youngest cultural ambassador in Charleston's history. Professor Townsend created an educational trust through Howard University, a full scholarship held in Amos's name for when the time came, plus a summer mentorship program beginning immediately. "When you're ready," Townsend told him. "No rush. The language waited 500 years. Howard can wait a few more." Nina's ruling became a landmark in heritage law. Within a year, the Fala Cree precedent was cited in 4 cases across 3 states, each one involving an oral tradition that someone had tried to silence. Desmond hung a framed newspaper clipping in the barber shop. The headline read, "The Boy Who Read the Room." Under it, a photo of Amos at the witness stand. Desmond never pointed it out to customers. He didn't need to. Every man who sat in his chair looked at it and said the same thing. "That's the kid from upstairs, isn't it? That's the kid from upstairs." The final image belonged to a Tuesday evening, 3 months after the trial. The apartment above the barber shop, evening light coming through the window in gold bars. Della was asleep in her chair, the pale blue hat on the hook by the door. The kitchen smelled like cornbread because Desmond had been up earlier. Amos sat at the table. The same table. Always the same table. The leather journal was open on the left, Della's handwriting, 10 generations of words. On the right, a new notebook. Brand new. Empty pages. He was writing. New words. New grammar entries. New proverbs for a new century. He wasn't preserving the language anymore. He was growing it, adding to it, giving it a future, not just a past. He spoke a sentence aloud in Fala Cree, something new, something his grandmother had never taught him, a sentence entirely his own, the first new sentence spoken in this language in 300 years. His voice filled the small apartment, warm, clear. 12 years old and 500 years deep. The museum put the contract behind glass, but the language was never behind glass. It was in a kitchen, in a grandmother's voice, in a boy's notebook. And now, for the first time in 500 years, it was growing again. Not because an institution finally listened, but because a boy refused to stop speaking. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. Subscribe so you never miss a story about people who refused to be erased. And leave a comment. What language, what tradition, what piece of knowledge did your family pass down to you?